We remember Justice Antonin Scalia and look at how his death will impact pivotal cases before the High Court. An attorney who went before the High Court will join us. Then the Democratic race heads west for tomorrow's important Nevada caucuses. We'll explain why the stakes are so high, especially for one Hillary Clinton. And the Republicans, for their end, they're in South Carolina for the first in the South when it comes to primaries. Why this could be make or break for some big GOP establishment names. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Friday night. Justice Antonin Scalia's body is lying in state at the Supreme Court today. Hundreds of people, including the President and First Lady, have paid their respects. Hundreds of mourners lining up in the cold at the Supreme Court to honor the late Justice Antonin Scalia.
Scalia's been a figure in my life for my whole lifetime, and his opinions are very influential.
He set an example for Americans that you can stand up on principle, you can stand up for the law.
Court police serving as pallbearers, and nearly 100 former law clerks serving as honorary pallbearers. The flag-draped casket slowly brought up the Supreme Court steps to lie in repose in the Great Hall of the Court, on the same pedestal that held the casket of President Abraham Lincoln. Inside, the 8 remaining justices standing in the order in which they sit on the Supreme Court bench, and Scalia's family attending the short private ceremony. Scalia's 2007 portrait on display, flanked by wreaths from the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Let us pray for the coming of the kingdom.
One of Scalia's sons, who is a priest, Father Paul Scalia, offering a prayer.
In your wisdom, you have called your servant Antonin out of this world.
A New York native, a conservative icon, the first Italian-American on the High Court, and the longest-serving justice. President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama among those paying their respects.
This is an opportunity for the President to both pay his personal respects to those who love Justice Scalia, but also pay tribute to the outsized impact that he had on our country and on our legal system.
And joining us now to talk about that impact and much more is Marc Fernich, professor at Brooklyn Law, and he's argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. And before I get into his legacy and some of the outstanding questions going forward, talk about your personal experience and what you remember, because he really changed the way oral arguments worked here in many ways. It was a staid, musty, if you will, quiet bench, but when he got there, he really changed that.
An active questioner, pugnacious, combative, very lively, a happy warrior, great sense of humor, obviously relished the job, loved what he did, and as you said, changed the dynamic of the court and the nature of oral argument, both for better or worse, because a lot of people now criticize oral argument as being too chaotic and just...
Including Chief Justice Roberts.
Correct, and just they're really having a conversation among themselves, and sometimes the advocates can feel like outsiders and just you're drumming your fingers waiting for them to stop, because oftentimes they're trying to persuade each other.
How about any personal anecdotes from your side when you went before the High Court?
Well, the case that I had involved statutory construction, the interpretation of a legal text, which is right in Scalia's wheelhouse, but he didn't seem terribly interested in my issue. I think that Alito was really the driving force in my case. He had a very memorable quip where, in his characteristic fashion, a very flip answer. The question was, what does it mean, a racketeering enterprise? And he said, I don't know, and everybody laughed, and that was that. But other than that, there were only really 2 comments that he made, and that was out of character for him.
He's been called the most influential justice in the last 25 years. Amazing when you consider he wasn't Chief Justice. Would you agree with that characterization?
Well, I think both things that you said are right, and both things that you said are telling. A provocative figure, a controversial figure, his ideology in terms of strict construction, originalism, the literal interpretation of text without regard to legislative history or the intent behind the statute. The law means what is written there, the plain text. Very influential and thought-provoking and incredibly influential in academia, but not a consensus builder, outspoken, and that's the reason why he didn't become chief, and his views, while very interesting and insightful, never gained majority traction, and as we've talked about on the show many times on our Wednesday night program, never really prevailed across a majority of the court. So an interesting person, probably one of the great legal philosophers of the 20th century, But ultimately, the views did not gain currency across the court.
Probably his most significant opinion that he wrote was after the Heller case, which
That's one of
reaffirmed
them, yeah.
the Second Amendment right to bear arms. He wrote, as was his wont, seemingly the majority of the opinions when he was with the majority, and even withering ones in the dissent.
Yep.
Talk about that case here and how it really shaped so much of where we are.
Well, what's interesting about Heller is, that was a pet project of his to revive the Second Amendment and take it out of the context of a militia and bring the right across the general citizenry at large. Not a popular opinion, but also not a far-reaching opinion. The holding of Heller was that you have a right to bear firearms in the home for self-defense, self-protection, not a sweeping necessarily conceal and carry. And now that Scalia is off the court, I mean, these have been an unpopular series of opinions, and there's a significant number of the justices that want to pare it back. So that's one of the areas of law where his demise will be greatly felt. A less important, a less well-known facet of Scalia's writings is that he would go, except in the political cases where all bets are off, he would go where his ideology would take him, even if it was an outcome that he disagreed with. So a guy who's very, very tough on crime, obviously no love lost for criminals, probably wrote the most consequential pro-defendant rulings of the last several decades.
Such a fair trial, right?
Well, the right of confrontation, cross-examination under the Sixth Amendment. He greatly expanded the nature of the confrontation right in a very controversial opinion called Crawford versus United States. Another unpopular opinion across, ironically, the liberal section of the court, and you may well see that line of cases pared back in his absence. Also, a harsh, outspoken critic of the federal sentencing guidelines, a champion of sentencing reform, and he achieved that. His view gained currency. Also, a view rooted in a literal interpretation of the Sixth Amendment. Unpopular among some justices on the court. You may see that stuff curtailed as well.
When I understand he hated using legislative history.
Correct.
Well, explain what that means to the audience.
Well, that's what I alluded to in technical jargon a little bit earlier. He believed the law meant what it said, and he didn't like to look behind the law to its purpose or to all the debates that went on in Congress up to the passage of the law. He took the text generally as it was and applied it quite literally unless the result was patently absurd.
And the famous opinion that he did in the recent gay marriage case where he took Justice Kennedy specifically wrote the majority opinion. He thought it was egotistic.
Pure applesauce.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, some people left that because he said, who are people here to decide what the Founding Fathers intended when they came about marriage? That said, Mark, there's now the intersection of politics into all of this, the appointment or not.
Well, he was unanimously confirmed. Can you imagine that happening in this day and age?
Right. So to that end, first of all, there's some key cases that they heard, from union dues to affirmative action upcoming, abortion cases. We now are firmly in a 4-4 court. You never know anything for sure, but you're going to have a limbo here, and depending what happens or doesn't happen, you could have no justices for the better part of a year. Well, no ninth justice.
To me, the most significant area where his absence will be felt is in Governor McDonnell's upcoming case in April, because he was...
Which Senator Menendez was watching closely.
Well, Menendez and SCALIA'S and Silver and my client, Malcolm Smith. This is a guy who is very critical of federal overcriminalization and was consistent with his federalist sort of states' rights view, and he was highly critical of criminalizing what he characterized, as the ordinary pull and tug of politics, criminalizing the ordinary giving of favors. And this was an argument, he was probably very influential in getting McDonnell's sentence stayed pending the appeal and getting the case heard by the court. This was a vote that in all likelihood McDonnell could have counted on, and maybe the decisive vote. So in my view, you're probably looking at a 4-4 split in McDonnell's case, which would result in the affirmance of his conviction, and bad news for my client and the two legislators who've just been convicted. Yeah.
I know I'm up against a break here, but it seems that there is political pressures building on both McConnell and to a degree certainly Grassley, who's the head of the Judiciary Committee. You better at least listen to who the candidates are, and you better at least have hearings, and probably you better have a vote. There are a couple candidates here, one more on the moderate end, another one that were confirmed 97-0. Overwhelmingly, they're sitting on the appeals court right now. Well, you mentioned Scalia,
right?
Strident conservative, everybody knew it at the time, unanimously confirmed. Can you imagine in this day and age, even a moderate, okay, that was appointed by a Republican to certain judgeships here, that could ever find that in today's political climate?
Well, it's really the timing of it more than anything else. And everyone, well, people who watch the show frequently know that I'm no great liberal, but there's really no legitimate reason for delaying the nomination. I mean, he is voted in for an 8-year term, and he has the right to nominate a replacement. I think it should depend on the bona fides, not the political views, but the merits and qualifications of the nominee. So you referenced indirectly Sri Srinivasan, who's the district court, D.C. Circuit Justice. The D.C. Circuit is traditionally a pipeline to the Supreme Court. He was an assistant solicitor general. He has a very formidable intellect and is undoubtedly qualified. If they hold back that nomination or unduly delay it, that's going to be pure politicking. It's going to look ugly.
As Justice O'Connor said, get on with it in terms of the process. See some other names here that people are thinking about. All right, Mark, stay with us. Okay. On the other side of the break, we're going to take a look, speaking of politics, at the race for the White House. And we'll start with the Democrats now. Hillary is trying to beat Bernie Sanders out in Nevada, what seemed to be a foregone conclusion, neck and neck as we speak.